Good morning and welcome to the 30th Economy, Energy and Fair Work Committee of 2020. Apologies have been received from Gordon MacDonald, and I welcome John Mason in his place, who is attending as a committee substitute. The first item on the agenda is a decision by the committee to take items 4, 5 and 6 and 7 in private. Are we agreed on that? Now, we then move on to item 2 on the agenda, which is the Heat Network Scotland Bill. And I think we should have on screen a number of attendees joining remotely. And they are, first of all, James Lambert, who is the Director of the Competition and Markets Authority, Charles Wood, Head of New Energy Services and Heat Energy UK, Marcus Hunt, who is the Director of Commercial Services and Investments, SGN Commercial Services, Donald McBrain, Business Development Manager of Scottish Water Horizons. Now, I think if you simply indicate when you want to come in, perhaps by raising your hand or typing in the chat box, which will either I or one of the clerks will see you and then bring you in. And if you wait, once the question has been asked, perhaps just a few seconds, so that broadcasting can turn your mic on, so that we don't miss the first part of what you're saying. Can everyone hear me loud and clear? Good, excellent. Well, I'll start with the first question, which is about the definitions in the bill. And I'm just wondering if all of you are satisfied with these, or whether you think there might need to be some tweaking or alteration of what the bill sets out as the definitions. Section 1, for example, defines a heat network as either a district heat network or a communal heating system. For starters, what are your views on that?
So from the Competition Market Authority's perspective, we were happy with the definitions in the bill. We thought it was important to retain flexibility, for example, in relation to future technology, but I think the bill already makes provisions for doing that.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I'm having slight difficulty with technology, so if you could simply raise your hand, that would make it easier for me to bring you in. Does anyone other than James have something they'd like to say about that? Yes, Charles Wood.
Good morning. Thank you, Convener. So the definition given in the bill is adequate. It does give enough leeway for future technologies and for the wide range of technologies that can be used for heat networks. So we are broadly happy with that. As secondary legislation and regulation are put in place, there may be need for more clarity, but at present we are very happy.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to say anything on that? For example, the definition of thermal energy in the bill, what would that mean in practice? How do you think that would work? Yes, Donald McBrain, please.
I think it may be useful to include within the scope and the definition ambient loops. And that's an emerging area of heat networks now, where you're distributing ambient temperatures that can then be boosted at individual building level. So it may not be adequately taken care of at the moment.
I mean, do you feel that the definitions are flexible enough to work with future changes that may happen in this area, technology-wise, for example? Are all of you satisfied with the definitions? Yes, Marcus Hunt.
Hi, Marcus Hunt here, SGN Commercial Services. I think we were again, very happy with the definition as it's set out in the bill. The one thing we thought was important really was to make sure that there's consistent language around this, and that communal heating systems, which could mean other types of heating system, are not effectively considered heat networks, and there just needs to make sure that there's a distinction between those things, and so there's no confusion for consumers going forwards. But other than that, we were happy that the bill gives flexibility for future.
Thank you. And do any of you feel that there needs to be a provision for consultation on matters as we move forwards? I'll take the silence as a no. Right, we'll move on then to questions from the Deputy Convener, Willie Coffey, who joins us remotely.
Thanks very much, Gordon, and good morning to the committee and to the panel. My questions are really all about licensing, and just to get a flavour of what the panel thinks about this. But I'll just roll a few questions together, Gordon, and see if we can get a little discussion going in this. Initially, does the panel support the proposals for licensing as they stand? What kind of things could we do to ensure that consumers are adequately protected in terms of things like pricing and quality and the maintenance of standards? Should prior experience be a factor in granting a licence? Should the licence standard conditions rest with the licensing authority as proposed in the bill? And probably lastly, Convener, on the issue about regulation, heat regulation is devolved to the Scottish Parliament, so who should regulate the industry? Do you think should Ofgem provide that service for us, or should we set up our own regulator? And just to have a little discussion around that would be very helpful, please. So maybe if I could firstly hear from Marcus and Donald, and then of course from James and Charles, that would be very welcome. Thank you.
Sure.
Marcus.
Yeah, thank you. So we definitely support a licensing regime for heat networks. I think one of the things we need to ensure with any licensing regime is that it's proportionate and that it balances consumer interests, obviously, and investor interests, to make sure that the intention of heat networks is delivering for all stakeholders. I think in terms of your question around who should effectively, govern the licensing regime, we think there are potentially some benefits in giving that to a authority such as Ofgem that's got some experience, obviously, of regulating energy networks, and that could provide some benefits. Oh, sorry, can you still hear me?
Yeah,
yes,
yeah.
Yes, we can.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, we think that an authority such as Ofgem may be well placed to regulate such heat networks, and we also think that I think the license conditions need to be prescriptive enough that they give consumers protection in the heat network space, but also give investors protection. To make sure that the networks, which are still a kind of an emerging market, could be successful and deliver as we hope they will do.
Thank you, Marcus. Donald, could I hear some views yet? Thank you very much. Yep.
Yeah, we see some real benefits in the licensing regime to drive consistency. And it's important for consumer protection, but it's also important for consistency in the way that networks are developed. Bringing in industry standards to the area would be really useful. So, for example, what we have seen in early developments is that something as simple as, say, water quality within a district heat network, there are different standards being promoted at the moment by designers. And that can lead to delays and debate, shall we say, whilst whilst the actual standard to be adopted within the network has been worked through. So getting that clarity is really important for designers, developers and contractors. This is important that those standards also support the longevity of the networks being developed. You want to have long-term assets in the ground that will stand the test of time, and I think that's where the specifications and the standards are really important.
Okay, thank you. James and Charles? Oh, Marcus, you want to come back?
Just to add one thing to the discussion, that just to build on Donald's points, is that one of the questions you asked was around whether previous experience should be taken into account in terms of who's provided a license. We believe that, I think, it's important to have competent and credible entities delivering heat networks to ensure, I guess, confidence from consumers and also other authorities. The thing I think we just need to be careful of is that, because this is an emerging market, and I think, has the potential to grow and gain interest from new entrants, it doesn't become a bar that's too high and effectively restricts it to a very small number of players who've already built and have a proven track record. So whilst we think there's a need to assure competence, there's also a need to ensure that it doesn't restrict new entrants, and that it recognises skills that might be quite similar to heat networks, but may not be specific to heat networks, such as other utility networks.
Thanks. James, Charles?
So we welcomed thank you. We welcome the proposal for licensing very much. We thought it was important to ensure that the requirements around fit and proper person to operate the heat network, and also for technical standards to protect consumers from poorly designed potentially expensive heat networks. In terms of who should be the regulator, we noticed in our report in 2018 that a number of stakeholders had identified Ofgem as being a potentially suitable regulator on the basis that it already has experience in the electricity and gas sectors, and also operates across Great Britain, including having an office and staff based in Scotland. And I think similar views were echoed in the working group which the Scottish Government convened last year. But we recognise that heat is devolved to the Scottish Government, so we didn't make any firm recommendations around who the regulator should be. I think there's some advantages of having consistency across Great Britain, but we're pleased to hear, having spoken to officials, that there is dialogue going on between the UK Government and Scottish Government officials in this area, and I think what I hear, progress has been made in reaching an agreement.
Okay, thanks, James. Charles?
So there's many points there, Willie. So firstly, good morning, and thank you for the questions, very good questions. But agree on licensing with everybody that's already spoken. It is absolutely critical that this part of the industry be brought up to the same standards that the rest of the industry is being held to. So having this sort of licensing and the licensing set forward seems sensible. In terms of should experience factor into applications, no, effectively, the quality of the application should be the factor, and you will see that those more experienced companies will, of course, be able to put in a more effectively higher quality application. But if a new competitor comes into the market, they should be able to compete on a level playing field with those other providers. In terms of consumer protections, how to establish those? Yes, put some of those in the licensing and require those, but it's very likely at this point that the Energy Ombudsman Services would step into that role. So just making sure that there's coordination across Scottish and UK governments on that approach, and that those consumer protections are at least held to the same sort of standards, regardless of who eventually takes control of those. And finally, on who the regulator should be, yes, agree that it is likely to be Ofgem, and we would see that as the sensible approach, just to keep consistency again. So yeah, consistency in all things, I think. So just effectively echoing everybody else's points.
Okay, thanks everybody for that. Just on this point about the regulator, I've looked at the UK government's framework document for heat networks. I think it came around at the start of this year, and it recognises the difference between Scotland and the rest of the UK in respect of some of the responsibilities. For example, in Scotland, in this area, we control building regulations, but the UK control fuel standards and fuel specifications and things like that. So there is a distinction to be made there. If we do go for a single regulator like Ofgem, does that imply that we must have a single set of regulations, or can we have different regulations to reflect the needs and aspirations of both Scotland and the rest of the UK and enshrine that in whatever arrangement we come to? Marcus?
Yeah, thank you. Just to build on the point, to answer that question, but to build on a point I think James and Charlie made earlier around consistency. I think one thing from my experience and looking at kind of how the water retail market for non-household customers evolved in Scotland and England, I think having a level of consistency, both from a licensing perspective in terms of how that's both applied for, evaluated and provided, and the conditions that accompany that license and the obligations it places on providers is quite important. I think any new entrant that's looking to get into the market, I think it creates challenges where licensing regimes are different, and effectively that creates cost and potential administrative burden that is perhaps eventually passed on to consumers. So I think where there can be consistency across licensing regimes, both in Scotland and England, that would help a lot, I think, from a new entrant's perspective, and it helps it helps not having to navigate different regimes, which can effectively cause complexity.
Okay. Any other comments on that before I hand back to the convener? Donald?
Yes, building on that point Marcus has just made with regards to competition in the water sector, I think it's an important point to think about here in heat with regards to potential failure of operators and supplier of last resort. In the water sector, obviously, there was a situation where it was competition evolved effectively from sitting incumbents. So you had a backstop there, you had a supplier of last resort already in place. Not necessarily the situation here where we're talking about evolving new market for heat networks. So I think it'd be interesting to see how, as the bill evolves, the supplier of last resort is dealt with.
Okay. Thanks, Donald. Thanks very much, convener. Back to you.
Thank you. I think Marcus Hunt wanted to make a brief point, perhaps, before we move on to questions from Colin Beattie.
No, sorry, I'd finished actually.
All right, that's fine.
I just echo what Donald said.
All right, thank you. Move on to questions from Colin Beattie.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. I'd like to explore some issues around the consenting process. Fuel poverty is included as a proposed assessment criteria for consents in the policy memorandum. Now, it doesn't appear on the face of the bill, although decarbonisation does. Do you think the consenting process adequately takes into account fuel poverty and decarbonisation? Any volunteer? No one? Does that mean you're happy with it, or you think they are adequately taken into account? Or no opinion? Yes, Charles.
Thank you for the question, Colin. Good morning. So we do think that it is adequate at this stage in terms of the coverage. The fact that it is recognised, the fact that it is included, both fuel poverty and carbon reductions. But as secondary legislation progresses, as you get more into the further detail of this and potentially some of the transitory requirements for going from the current market to this new market, You will have to get into further detail about how fuel poverty is addressed, and that will be absolutely critical to making sure that this addresses the needs of consumers first, that it does include reductions in carbon as something that consumers need.
That fuel poverty should appear on the face of the bill, along with decarbonisation. Yes, Marcus?
Sorry, yeah, just to really reinforce and add to what Charles said, it feels to me at the moment the bill, you know, at this stage is quite high level, and it talks about it. Clearly, I think the next evolution of legislation or the next stage of legislation needs to bring that out in more detail to ensure, you know, consumers that are suffering fuel poverty are adequately catered for. And that it takes into account decarbonisation, but needs to be balanced in the case that it allows enough flexibility for different solutions in heat networks that help move it forward, and isn't too prescripted over a single technology. But it feels to me that the bill at this stage caters for some of this, but that the secondary legislation or the detail that needs to sit under that for us to have more visibility of how it's catered for is still needs to be established.
Okay, just to take another question. We talked briefly, I think, earlier on about future technologies and so on. Should the benchmark for carbon emission comparisons be current or future technologies? Is there a danger in using one or the other? Have I got all the difficult questions today? Thank you, Donald.
I think that the word was used earlier on of flexibility. I think the key here is flexibility, that we have that ability to, difficult sitting here today, you know, knowing what's going to come forward in 10, 15, 20 years' time from the point of view of innovation. But I think we need to make sure that whatever's put in place, the system is flexible enough to take account of that, and we can bring those future technologies into play. I think just slightly leading back to the last set of questions, that there will be a balance between the lowest carbon and lowest cost when you consider fuel poverty as well. So that's always going to be a tricky one.
Just continuing on that, is there any way to future-proof the consenting process to take into account the sort of emerging technologies and fuels? What kind of flexibility could be built into it? How do we do that? Clearly, it can't just be wide open. Charles?
So to a degree, it does have to have some openness. Having openness in the terminologies and making sure that the approach is technology neutral is absolutely required, but you can still within that be setting requirements for fuel poverty, for decarbonisation, for the amount of allowable emissions made by a heat installment. So you can just restrict that to what is it that you want the outputs to be rather than what you want the input to be. There are ways to get around that just with some wide wording and allowing flexibility to make adjustments later on as to that legislation at a later date.
Changes in terminology and so forth be in the bill at this point. Marcus, I see you've got your hand up there.
Yeah, sorry, just to add to that, I think one thing we certainly believe is that heat networks, to a certain extent, provide a good insurance policy in terms of decarbonisation, so that whilst the heat network may be originally constructed on a specific technology, what it does is allow you to potentially change that technology over time without disrupting the heat network that's been established. So that if, for example, a new technology emerges over the course of time, you can change the underlying fuel source that powers the heat network, but keeps the heat network in place. And I think there's a risk in trying to future-proof it too much at this stage, in that it may therefore not allow heat networks to emerge as quickly and as efficiently as they could do, which I think trading those two things off is a difficult balance, but would be a shame if future-proofing it became prohibitive, I guess.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. And now Rhoda Grant.
Can I ask about deemed consent and whether that is the right way forward or whether we need more checks and balances in the system? Anyone got any thoughts? Donald?
I think probably from a developer's point of view, it's helpful because it provides that certainty. But there may need to be some checks and balances in there, perhaps some sort of appeals process around it. And I think the certainty is useful from deemed consent for a developer.
Anybody else have any thoughts, especially maybe about the role of local authorities and indeed communities, if the communities are being impacted by the heat network? Should they have a role in determining the application? Charles?
So that is a very important question. The decarbonisation of heat across the UK and particularly across Scotland is absolutely reliant on getting consumers to understand what's happening and to understand that their existing method of heat may be high carbon and that they should be going on to something else, engaging with those consumers and saying, here are the options, here's a few different ways that you can do this, and explaining to them what it is that the process would be, how they would operate their heating within a heat network, giving them an understanding and some ability to consent to the process and agree to that process. Because if you don't, that's when some of the complaints will be higher, some of the issues that consumers have with those heat networks might be more problematic, and that may cause further headaches for yourselves and for local authorities and for developers in future. So getting ahead of that by engaging at the local level, getting local authorities involved and using their ability and their reach into that community to state, this is what's going to happen and here's how you can input into that process is absolutely critical to getting people on board, getting them to understand and getting them to make the most of those new assets. So yeah, absolutely critical that they have a say and some sort of input in the process.
Any other comments on that? I mean, for instance, should communities be convinced of the need of heat networks? Should this kind of be a grassroots move from communities who want to engage together to build heat networks rather than have that happen to them by somebody out with their community?
Yes, so there should be a degree of that where we're looking at things like public buildings being decarbonised using heat networks or public spaces being decarbonised. That makes a lot more sense for a larger developer to come in. But when it's at that community level, getting them involved and giving them understanding and consent is really helpful in terms of pushing forward that agenda. If you look at the existing understanding of consumers, they understand climate change, they understand decarbonisation, and they want to contribute to that. They want to contribute to efficiency and lower costs for their neighbours. So they are looking forward to being able to do that. But you also look at the statistics that tell us that around 60% of consumers don't even recognise that their boiler is an emitting technology. So getting past that understanding and getting them engaged is the first step. And then whether they want to progress something themselves and apply their own approach to the heat network and bring in their own application, or if they want to go to a third party and just say, this is an area, this is a zone in which we'd like a heat network, please apply here. So figuring out the difference between those approaches is, as long as there's leeway and flexibility between the two within the bill and within the consenting approach, that's absolutely fine. There should be a mix of those solutions.
Marcus and then James.
Yes, thank you. Just to add to something Charles said, and I guess reflecting on the level of engagement consumers sometimes have with energy, it feels that in order to help promote heat networks, there needs to be sort of perhaps more consumer engagement and communication around heat networks, what their benefits are, at sort of a more macro level as well, so that when these sorts of schemes emerge in a local, local authority or in a particular region, people have some understanding of what they mean, and can effectively, I suppose, distinguish between a heat network and other types of energy sources. And I guess going to Charles's point that if we take the situation at the moment where people don't realise their boilers are emitting, that's quite a big step to move to a position where they would, understand heat networks in totality. So it feels that some form of consumer engagement and communications programme would really support this bill and help people and the wider public understand the benefits of heat networks.
Thank you. Just to add to the points on consumer engagement, when we published our report, we identified a number of issues around a lack of consumer engagement with heat networks, and in turn that could lead to poor outcomes for consumers if people didn't understand, for example, they're moving on to a heat network or what the terms and conditions were, and there are issues around, for example, transparency of billing and so on. So I think any initiative to help consumers engage with heat networks would be positive.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. And now questions from Maurice Golden, who joins us remotely.
Thank you, convener, and welcome panel. I'm interested in the transfer scheme, and particularly regarding Scottish Water's evidence regarding the potential omission in the bill of how existing heat networks will be treated and what happens if these schemes fail to get a licence. How would they then be transferred, and any valuation around these? Perhaps you could clarify your concerns and suggest how the bill could be improved. Donald, are you able to?
Thank you. Yeah, it's really around the point of, I think it's been made on previous questions around further detail. We would really interested to see, because there are existing schemes in place already, obviously, and if we're talking about having LDs areas that then become zones, if you like, those zones could have existing projects within them, and how would the allocation to when consent be, how would it then deal with existing schemes? Really, it was more a query and a request for more detail around that, so that we know how existing schemes that are operational would be dealt with.
Thank you, Donald. Do any of the other panels have any commentary on how transfer schemes would best be operate and be reflected in the bill? James, I'm wondering from a kind of consumer protection angle, how these transfer provisions would help existing customers and how they could be addressed.
So I think a starting point, heat networks are natural monopolies, and we look with interest the transfer requirements as a way of ensuring that after a period of time that there can be competition for heat networks. I think what was important was to ensure, I think as the bill already seeks to do, that incumbency advantages were removed in that process, so there can be a genuine fresh competition at the right point in time. And I think in turn that gives the opportunity for a bidder to come up with proposals which include price and service quality for customers, and also allows an opportunity for innovation to potentially be injected into the bidding process.
The market at the moment, how likely is competition for any transfer of assets likely to occur?
I think it's difficult to say at this stage. We didn't gather evidence specifically in our market study on transfers because that was predated the bill, so we didn't particularly gather information on that. I mean, I think it's certainly the case from the evidence we did gather that there is interest in the heat network sector across the UK. I think what we heard quite consistently from potential investors was the question of scale and whether there be sufficient demand and schemes of sufficient scale to justify bringing the larger investors into the marketplace. So I think the bill already has some commentary on, for example, through zoning to gather or to have a base load and network connections, which would lead to a sort of assured base for any bidder.
Thank you, James. Just in terms of how the market develops vis-a-vis a UK-wide market where, you know, consumers and those operators would be facing the same costs and prices, versus if you created two markets, one in Scotland, one in the rest of the UK, is it possible, or is there a trade-off between the price the consumer receives and the attractiveness on investment? And clearly, if there's two markets, how likely is it that those two markets would function exactly the same and avoid any trade-off?
It's a good question. I think it's quite difficult to answer just on the basis that there's such heterogeneity amongst heat networks. So across England and Wales, and also across Scotland, based on our engagement and visits to various heat networks, there's such a wide variety of networks in terms of their cost base and the prices that they charge. It's almost quite difficult to imagine almost a separate sort of Scottish and rest of UK market. It's much more of almost a continuum of schemes, I think, in many ways, albeit there are some specific factors in Scotland, for example, around some policies, but also around, I think, the high prevalence of smaller schemes, for example. And in terms of the price paid by customers, I think we saw a close link with the cost of networks. So if there's efficiency in the process, particularly in the design and build stage, for example, in scale or attracting this to investors, so for example, competing bids for a network, I think that in turn could help consumers through lower prices, as long as consumers are able to benefit through the contracts that are designed.
Thank you, James. Charles, you'd like to come in, and then Marcus.
Yes, thank you, Horace. So the level of competition you're seeing currently not going to be reflective of the level of competition you'll see once the bill is in place and once you've gotten into the further detail. And that is one of the reasons that we really enjoy the fact that you've brought this bill forward, is because it's giving that confidence to investors. It's going to reduce the risk of investment. It's going to increase the number of people who want to participate in this area. And heat networks are not a new technology. They're not a brand new thing that everybody's trying to wrap their heads around. It's something that's been in place across the UK for a long time. So this market is fit for sort of moving forward and for having a great expansion. And this bill absolutely will help with that. So the level of competition in the first early years may be slow. It may be a lower number than you would like to see. But the fact that you've got this bill in place means that that competition will improve and grow as it develops, as the market develops. And you certainly shouldn't be hesitating about Scotland moving faster than the rest of the UK. It's absolutely a boon to the rest of the market for Scotland to be moving at pace. And given your specific decarbonisation targets, it's absolutely necessary that you move forward at this pace. The rest of the market can catch up, but Scotland should absolutely move forward, and that will increase that competition and deliver some of those benefits to consumers very quickly.
Thank you. Marcus.
Yeah, thanks, Marcus. I don't think this addresses quite your questions specifically, but I do think one thing that helps to attract investors is clarity over the pipeline and the opportunity over the long term. And I think one of the challenges with heat networks is having visibility of that pipeline and understanding the sort of the projects and when they're likely to come to market. And it feels to me that if we were to get that established, then actually some of those other issues may well fall away, and that may actually be more important.
Thank you. Thank you, panel. Thank you, convener.
Just to follow up on some of these questions, James, how exactly is this going to assist a consumer in terms of the differences that come in if heat networks come in terms of competitiveness, or perhaps better worded, value for money? If we think in terms of the way things are set up at the minute, individual customers can simply change provider, at least in theory, once they've gone through the various difficulties that may arise in doing that. How is this going to provide consumers individually with an ability to ensure that they're getting the best quality of delivery in terms of what they're looking at, rather than, if I put it that way, rather than in terms of simply lowest price, so best quality and effective service?
I think if the tender is well constructed, I think it would enable there to be a range of factors taken into account in the bidding process. So, for example, price, but also service quality, technical expertise, for example. So, for example, in some other markets, all those factors count in a scoring system towards selecting the winning bidder. So I think it would be important to not only ensure the initial price, but to ensure that the consumers are able to benefit over the life of the contract through, for example, the terms of the contract over time, and also the quality insurance that will be in place.
But I think what you're saying, that's, I mean, the individual consumer is not going to have the flexibility, will they, in terms of the provision of services here? So how does the individual consumer ensure value for money? I'm not saying this system can't provide that, but how does that happen? Because surely it's more inflexible than if simply individual consumers are deciding.
So I think there's a challenge within the heat network sector around the role for individual consumers on the basis that once someone's on a heat network and contracts are long, it's difficult, if not impossible, to switch either because they're in a contract or if they have to continue to pay a standing charge, even if they were, for example, to install their own electric heating, for example. I think what we recommended in that area was to empower the consumer as much as possible through transparency. So transparency prior to moving into a heat network, and then also once on a heat network, to have transparency of billing, standing charges, for example. So consumers then have the ability to go to an ombudsman, for example, to raise complaints or to challenge their bills.
Yes, I'm not sure that going to an ombudsman will make a difference to the service the consumer receives. I should also say, if there's issues that we raise or that are raised during the session that you want to write into the committee on, please do so if you don't feel you've had an opportunity to properly cover matters, or if there's specific detail you want to go into which we don't have time for here. I'll perhaps let Marcus come in on this point before we move on to questions from John Mason. Marcus.
Yes, I think one thing we felt that perhaps wasn't addressed as fully in the bill, and maybe at this stage is too early, but I think is a consideration and goes to this point, is how do you ensure consumer interests are protected when we are effectively creating natural monopolies, as James says, and without some level of safeguard or economic regulation. How do we ensure that consumers aren't disadvantaged going forward? So I think we would probably like to see regulation in an economic sense evolve over time, proportionate to the size and scale of the market, but that gives consumers protection and ensures that those natural monopolies aren't exploited.
Before we move on to John Mason, how would that be accomplished or achieved in the bill?
Oh, sorry, I lost you then. Could you?
Sorry, I'm just wondering how that could be accomplished or achieved by the bill. It may be something people want to think about and perhaps write back into the committee after today's session. I think it would be useful, following on from what you've said, Marcus, for us to have some idea of how that can or will be achieved through the bill.
Yes, and it feels like that's another consideration to pick up afterwards, which isn't addressed specifically in the bill, and maybe outside the jurisdiction that the bill was intended to meet.
Right. Well, I think we'll move on to questions from John Mason now, if we may.
Thanks very much, Convener. And I was interested in Mr. Wood's point that we should be encouraging pace and we want to move all this forward. And it has been suggested in some of the evidence the committee has received that there should be more of an obligation to connect new buildings, public sector buildings and non-domestic buildings. So I'd be interested, maybe Mr. Wood to start with, in your thoughts as to should there be more compulsion, should there be more obligation in all of this?
Thank you, John. So when it comes to new builds in particular, it certainly should be obligation to be at least considering what the lowest carbon options are. If it's not a heat network, then it should be another option, another technology that can reduce the carbon emissions of that building further than the heat network would be able to. But this sort of comes back to the point on community and the point on local engagement. And if you can coordinate local industry and attract local industry or new industries to come into local areas. For example, if you've got a data processing center, if someone places that in the local area, you can use the excess heat coming from that or from industrial processes or say, sort of heavy goods industry, manufacture of steel, for example, if you can attract those organizations to come and join the local community and in doing so, use that otherwise wasted heat to help heat people's homes and public buildings, then you are effectively bringing them into that community and helping to have a further sense of a community decarbonisation effort and creating their ability to move on to local area energy planning. And that's something that Scotland has certainly been leading in terms of the approach to local heat and energy efficiency strategies and the ability to just start looking at and examining how local areas' assets should be connected and brought together into a coordinated plan for decarbonisation. Heat networks are absolutely critical to that. And if new buildings can be obliged to either be net zero when they're at the point of building or connected to a heat network and contributing something to decarbonisation of the local area, then that would be a positive development.
So if I can just press you maybe on that, and then come on to Mr. McBrain and others. Who should be driving that then? Should that be the local authority that's driving it? Should it be the local community that's driving it? or should it be the business or whoever is coming in, or the development company? I mean, I've got, for example, in my constituency, I've got the Commonwealth Games Village. That was very much agreed that this should be the way forward, a heat network. But who should be driving it in a new project?
So that's a difficult question. It slightly depends on the local circumstances. I think in your circumstances where you've got an existing heat network, it makes sense for the council to be looking at that as the option and pushing the new connecting party to be connecting to that heat network. But there is a significant role for consistency to be delivered by Scottish Government, to be delivered at a higher level, to say this is the approach that should be taken in terms of if you want to connect to this local area right next to a heat network, full consideration should be given to connecting to that heat network. It can't just be a matter of, oh, well, there is a heat network there, but we're not going to connect because we don't feel like it. It should be, we've looked at the cost benefit analysis, we've looked at the approach and what impact this would have on decarbonisation, on fuel poverty, and on our ability to contribute to the local economy. And those factors should be factored into whether or not that decision is made to connect. So it should be a consistent approach across Scottish Government, but there is a role for local authorities to enforce and push that.
Okay, thank you. Now, was it Mr. McBrain? You were going to come in on that as well, was it? Yes.
Yeah, just on the point of the large local authority anchor loads, I think there's merit in compulsion to connect, because it's these big loads that actually help to make projects stack up and make them viable. That you can then, once you've got effectively a heat island, you can then build out from and connect more and more properties. Having that base load from local authority type buildings that are, they're long term, it's a consistent demand, it's the sort of thing that makes an investment stack up, makes a project stack up that you could then grow from.
Okay, thank you. I don't know if either of the other two wanted to come in at this point, or I'll move on. My next question was really aimed at SGN, because I was interested in your submission that you were suggesting that permits should be in perpetuity. Now, that was interesting, because that sounds like not only a monopoly, but a monopoly forever. And I mean, my thought would have been, well, surely the costs will be covered after 15 or 25 years, the capital costs, so surely at that point it shouldn't be in perpetuity. So could you comment a little bit further on that?
Yeah, sure. So sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, we're hearing you, Mr. Hunt.
Sorry. Yeah, I think we suggested that the license effectively lasts into perpetuity in the same way that I think other regulated licenses do. And our view on that was really to protect the interests of consumers in the case that the license was effectively removed, and what would happen to the consumers in that instant. I think if there was some form of supplier of last resort regime or other framework established that protected consumers, then maybe that would be less of an issue. But I'm not sure that was entirely clear in the bill. So if a heat network licensee was revoked for some reason, perhaps for non-performance on another network, and that license was no longer provided, what would happen to consumers? I think that was the angle we were really coming for on that specific point. And I guess also that there's a question about what is the right time frame, and therefore, for investment to be certain and established, I guess it needs to be time bound to an appropriate point that, like you say, recovers that investment. And I think different schemes will have different profiles, and therefore a sort of a one-size-fits-all approach perhaps doesn't work there. And I think that's what we were really coming at that point from. I
mean, presumably something like the pipe work to convey the water around has a fairly predictable life. I mean, I don't know what it is. Is it 30 years or 50 years or something like that? I mean, the generation capacity might be more unpredictable, might be shorter term. But, I mean, I think the fear would be if it's in perpetuity that, although you're arguing that it protects consumers, surely there's also a risk that consumers are exploited because somebody has got that permit forever.
I think we would expect them to have it forever in the case they were delivering on their license conditions and contract, not if they were in breach. So I think it was in the context of that point, rather than just awarding it regardless of how people performed against it.
Okay, thanks. I don't know if any of the others want to come in on that particular point. Yes, Mr. Lambert and then Mr. Wood.
Thank you. So, as I mentioned before, we did see advantages in having a tendering process at a super point in time in order to allow fresh competition to take place, and also to, for example, allow innovation. My understanding from the policy document associated with the bill is that there would be a supplier of last resort process introduced. So I'm not close to the detail of it, but just in relation to the point that Marcus made, I think it obviously is important for a consumer protection perspective to have a supplier of last resort process in place.
And Mr. Wood?
Yes, this is big back to your point, John. If there is a contract that goes over a certain period of time, it should be allowed that the organisation that first set up the heat network is able to get a reasonable return on that sort of established network. But at that point, once they've reached that sort of tipping point, there should be a competitive process. Competition is effectively a positive measure across energy markets. It reduces costs, it encourages companies to have better customer service, to create efficiencies. So having a tender process after that initial investment is recovered and some reasonable revenue is brought back into that company does make a lot of sense. So yeah, absolutely agree with your point there.
Okay, thanks very much. And my final point, if I may, Convener, is in relation to Scottish Water, because I understand you had a situation in Stirling, or you have a situation in Stirling, where it's joint with the council and Scottish Water are producing the heat and the council are distributing it. And I think you were raising the point about would that be a complication for permits and licences. Could you expand on that a wee bit, where you think the problem might be?
Really just around, I think, the definitions around network and whether network included the energy centre aspect of that. So we've got a situation where effectively we've developed, there's a few points perhaps linking here as well. We've got the energy centre that we've developed at the wastewater treatment works, uses heat from the wastewater. So it's quite a circular economy, low carbon type approach, and that heat then goes out into the network that the council own. So in terms of the definition of the licence, what does it cover? Does it cover two operators, within one contract there effectively? More a question of how that energy centre aspect would be handled within the bill in the next stage of the bill. Because you could see, for example, over time, as the council's network grows, which they intend it to do, there could be other forms of heat from other generators coming into that same network. So it might not just be our energy centre supplying heat there. So it's a query around how the bill would handle that kind of situation. And then linking back to previous points, I think around asset longevity, you're right. We would expect the network to last probably 50 plus years, properly looked after, taking into account some of the previous points I've made around standards and specifications for things like water quality within a network. Whereas the energy centre technology, depending on the technology, will be much shorter in duration. So combined heat and power, maybe 15 years, fuel cell, maybe 20, heat pumps, maybe 20 plus. So you've got a misalignment there, if you like, in terms of asset life. But that is good from the other query that was raised, which was around future flexibility for innovation. Once you've created the initial project, you have that network created that can then naturally look to the latest innovation as the energy centre technology comes to the end of its asset life, which is much shorter. I hope that answers your question. It's a bit of a waffle.
Yes. Well, my final point would be, do you think that all of that, the detail of like you and Stirling, needs to be in the face of the bill, or can that be left to further down the line regulations or whatever?
Yeah, I think it could be left further down the line in terms of the regulations, but as long as it's recognised that that's the situation that exists currently within the market.
Convener.
Thank you. Alison Harris.
I would like to just follow on from that line of questioning and ask, how can the interests of the consumer be best represented and indeed enforced in projects where there actually is no single person or no single body responsible? Who would like to come in first? Okay, Charles, I think you were first.
Thank you, Alison. So the interests of the consumer do need to be protected. I would point to examples of how the existing energy sector has been taking care of consumers throughout the past year. Throughout COVID, Energy UK has taken on a role as a convener of all of the points and pressure points and any issues that industry is encountering as we go through those 6 months. And we've seen a lot of examples of companies making sure that their consumers are still connected, are still able to top up their prepayment meters, and no one's going cold throughout COVID. And we will continue to do that, but it's important that that is also reflected into HeatNet. So you're absolutely right to ask that question of how their needs are protected. It's really important that, and I'm sure the CMA may want to step in on this, but organisations like the CMA and the Systems Advice Bureau for Scotland are stepping into that role and giving advice and understanding for consumers. And it's also important that whenever a consumer is on a heat network, they understand who it is they're supposed to call if something goes wrong. They should have a direct route of recourse if anything's happening that they are unhappy with or uncomfortable with. It's really important we get those processes right from the get-go. So this bill is a really useful tool in making sure that's in place for licensees.
Okay, thank you. And I think it was Donald who wanted to come in?
I think if the query was around the particular example I gave in the Stirling context, we are contractually bound to Stirling, and then the council is contractually bound to its end users, so obligations around price and service are bound within that.
Okay.
So rather than one, it's not a mishmash, if you like, of different people there. That it's a clear line of sight through to the end consumer.
Okay, thank you. And is it James? Did you want to add something?
That's right. Thanks very much. So we see a sector regulator as playing a key role in protecting heat network customers. In advance of regulation coming in, we recommended that heat networks sort of get on the front foot, as it were, and adopt the best standards they can. For example, there's guidance from the Heat Trust on consumer protection. I think Charles was right to raise the point around consumers having information about heat networks and knowing who to call, and recognising the role of organisations such as Citizens Advice Scotland in terms of seeking advice where there are concerns about the operation of the heat network at an early stage.
Okay, thank you. Now, also, whether I would like to follow on with whether the key criteria as set out in section 39 are adequate for the designation of all possible and relevant anchor buildings. What would you think about that?
There was a question directed to me.
I think anyone that's
Anyone?
able to or comment on section 39. So James, if you want to come in on that.
No, I'm afraid I didn't have a strong view on that point, actually, in terms of it's not an area that we've been particularly close to in our report or subsequent engagement with the Scottish Government.
Okay, thank you. Well, if I could move on to my final question, I would like to say, given that Part 5 only requires building assessment reports to be carried out on publicly owned buildings, would you say there's a risk that community-owned buildings and other potential anchor buildings that require considerable and constant use of thermal energy will be missed out? No one want to come in on that?
Is no one wishing to comment on that? I'll take that as a no comment from all four of you then.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. We'll move on to questions from Richard Lyle.
Thank you, Convener. My questions are still in regards to Alison Harris. Her questions regarding Part 5 of the Bill, Building Assessment Reports, which places a duty on public sector building owners to assess the viability of connecting their building to a heat network. I'm going to ask each panel member, a specific question, which hopefully they will answer. Marcus Hunt, do you have an opinion on why the duty does not apply to all non-domestic buildings, and should it be extended?
Sorry, my connection is breaking a bit. I'm not sure I caught that. Apologies, Richard.
That's okay. Do you have an opinion on why the duty does not apply to all non-domestic buildings, and should it be extended?
No, I don't have an opinion on that, I'm afraid.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next question to Donald McBrain. How could the information used by local authorities in designating heat network zones be improved to ensure that the most suitable areas are designated?
Good question.
I'm looking for a good
I think
answer.
There's probably. I think obviously there's the LHE's work ongoing at the moment, which will help that. The heat maps are used by the industry at the moment that have been created by the Scottish Government, so they're helpful. I think there's also there's opportunity to look at the likes of what we've got a resource potential of reusing wastewater for heat recovery. So there's potential to overlap those kinds of asset layers to make sure that systems and potential projects have looked at all the potential opportunities and the potential solutions around providing low-cost, low-carbon district heat networks. So I think it's a case of making sure that all the relevant aspects, whether it's from Scottish Water or whoever, have been taken account of within the LHE's work that's ongoing at the moment.
Okay, thanks for that, Donald. Next question to Charles Wood. Is it likely that this process will rely on existing data from Energy Performance Certificates, EPCs? If so, what are the strengths and weaknesses to this approach?
So there is a degree to which the process will rely on EPCs and the existing data that's available. The EPC is the most commonly available bit of data that can be used to check out the housing stock and what the local building stock has in terms of capabilities, in terms of weaknesses. but it is not the be-all and end-all. It's something that can be improved upon. EPCs don't necessarily take into account everything that could be factored into heat, for example, but that is a very useful basis to begin the process. I think further issues will have to be looked at in terms of what are the local information that you can gather from networks, whether that's the gas network or the electricity network, on what capacity is available, what the best solution would be in terms of the lowest cost option that requires the least investment in new network capacity. You also have to look at things like what is the local workforce available? So do you have the right number of installers and engineers and construction workers ready to take part in the process? Do you have the manufacturing available locally? Do you have a local supply chain that could really be bolstered by a heat network? And also, what sort of local industry do you have that could get engaged in the process and could be offering waste heat, or as Don said, the waste water that could be used as well to be used in heating. So a lot of different factors come into this. EPCs are part of it, but they are not the whole picture. There are new technologies that should be explored as well, just in terms of technologies that give you a better understanding of where the energy efficiency issues may be across the housing stock, and give you potentially more granular data on where you should be targeting interventions. And that certainly is something that should be looked at as you further progress this approach to local deployment and local heat zones.
Thank you, Charles. My next question is to James Lambert, who is, I notice, Director of Competition and Markets Authority. You know as well as I do, better than I do, that heating is a cost to people, and basically we have to, sometimes it's heating or eating, and we have to try and see if we can get a better cost for heating. So how should information for consumers be presented to ensure that they fully understand the cost and the implication of living in a property with a heat network? Is there a risk that this might not be adequately conveyed by property agents and landlords? What's your opinion on that, James?
Thank you. So we did see a risk before somebody moves into a property, either through an estate agent or through a landlord, if there being insufficient information about a heat network. That was based partly on consumer survey work, but also our own survey. Most of the feedback we had was that the energy performance certificates were not sufficient alone, partly because the information they included was very limited, and particularly with regard to heat networks, there wasn't sufficient information on the ongoing cost of a network, particularly in terms of standing charges and operation and maintenance. And then once somebody moved into a property, there are issues with, in some cases, not having a contract. There are issues with the frequency of billing, issues with the way in which bills were presented, particularly in terms of breakdown of charges between usage and standing charge. So the recommendations were for there to be improved transparency prior to people moving into a property, which would require engagement across government, and then also requirements for more regular and more detailed bills being made available to consumers, and that a regulator would have a role in overseeing that.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, panel. That's me, convener.
Thank you. And finally, Andy Whiteman.
Thanks very much, convener. Thank you. Good morning, panel. I just want to return, first of all, to a question that Rhoda Grant asked about local engagement, and very specifically in the consenting regime under Part 2. At the moment, the consenting is granted by Scottish ministers. Local authorities, either as local authorities or as planning authorities, have no role in the system, and that contrasts strongly with, for example, Denmark, where their 98 municipalities are responsible for approving projects within a national framework, of course. So I just want to ask you whether you believe it's right to exclude local government from any role in the consenting process. Charles Wood.
So to answer your question directly, no. It's not right to exclude local authorities. They certainly have a better understanding typically of what the local attributes are in terms of housing stock, in terms of what public buildings they have access to and what their plans are for decarbonisation. If you look across the UK, you can see that various different local authorities have come up with their own net zero targets, their own plans, their own intentions. And you can also see that looking just in Scotland, for example, Dundee with electric vehicle charging, or Fife with their own heat network, there are ways in which local authorities can progress the agenda a lot faster. So including them is absolutely critical to making sure that the local community is on board. But we understand the desire to allow for ministers to have that overarching coordination role, so to bring together local authorities, industry, and any other stakeholders that may want to feed into the process. And that will help to reduce the amount of divergence between local authorities and hopefully enable better coordination across local authority borders to make sure that if a heat network crosses borders, or if there are sort of complementary schemes going on nearby, you're able to coordinate across those rather than having a completely different approach to, say, planning from one section to another.
Okay, does anyone else have a view on that question? Nope. Yes, Donald McBrain.
Other than to say, just I think Charles has answered that really well, but particularly the point that the cross-boundary coordination and collaboration opportunity shouldn't be missed. So I think, yeah, previous response, I would thoroughly agree with.
Very much. I just want to move on to look at part 6 of the bill, which provides licence holders with compulsory purchase powers and rights to enter into network wayleave rights with landowners, and to do that with compulsion, with Scottish Ministers' consent. Now, broadly speaking, as I understand it, utilities require these powers, and therefore there's no real dispute about having these in the bill as a matter of principle. I'm just really wondering if they're appropriately framed. And in particular, I noticed that Scottish Gas Networks, in your evidence, you're saying that alternative methods should be fully explored before compulsory action is taken. I don't dispute that, but I'm just wondering if there's something behind that statement that you might wish to elaborate on. And in terms of Scottish Water Horizons, you say that compulsory purchase and wayleave rights could have deleterious effects on your ability to develop and operate assets. So I wonder if you could expand on what those deleterious ones are. So maybe start with Marcus Hunt.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, I think our point here was that compulsory purchase is clearly a fairly, or could be seen as a fairly extreme measure, and could effectively disenfranchise consumers if compulsory purchase was involved in a heat network scheme, and that could be detrimental to the overall scheme. So I think our point really was just that if compulsory powers were to be part of the bill, that could have an impact on consumer engagement, which could undermine the objectives that the bill was trying to achieve. That was our angle on this, really. I don't think we'd given any consideration as to specifically what alternatives would may be available at this point.
Okay, but just before I move on to Donald, just come back to you, Marcus, on that. I mean, Scottish Gas Networks have access to compulsory purchase powers, do they not?
So that's a good question, but that's probably a question for the regulated business rather than the commercial services business. So the regulated business will have powers for certain rights relating to its network. I honestly don't know if that extends to compulsory purchase. I know it does have wayleaves and rights over land where it has its assets. But that's part of the regulated business. In the non-regulated business, that's not something I'm so familiar with, I'm afraid. I can certainly bear with my colleagues though, and come back on that.
Okay, Donald McBrain, you're not part of the regulated business either, but maybe you can comment on your the comment you make about deleterious effects.
Yes, you're correct. I'm not part of the regulated business either. But if I may, I'll just come back to the compulsory purchase powers. Firstly, that's something that the regulated business we have. We can't have compulsory purchase powers, but it's very much viewed as the last resort, but also viewed as a necessary tool if there is a scheme that's in the public good that there's no other way to overcome some barriers. And there's some very clear guiding principles that are established around consultation and engagement and all various steps before you get to that stage. With regards to deleterious effects, if I may come back to you in writing with more detail on this, given that it is the regulated business that's responded on that particular point. But my understanding is that it's so that it's we're clear that there's no precedence, if you like, or order of precedence in terms of heat networks potentially impacting on our regulated business. If we need to do something in a particular area, that the heat network would take precedent over that. So we need to make sure that the relevant utilities are aligned. But as I say, given it's not my part of the business, I would like to come back to you just in writing on that.
Okay, that's fair enough. I mean, I'm assuming that in terms of electric, gas, water, I mean, all these utilities face the same issue, that each other may be operating underground mostly and potentially impacting on others, and that there are established protocols in place to manage that. That's my assumption. So if that's not the case, and if Scottish Water have any particular concerns in relationship to water, and they might, because heat networks will involve the conveyance of hot water, it would be useful if you could come back to that as well. Scottish Water also say in their evidence that there should be some thought given to how to secure decommissioning costs. I mean, is there any evidence from existing utilities about how that process is managed, or is that not really relevant? I mean, we're still living with Victorian sewage systems, for example, so decommissioning hasn't become an issue there.
Yeah, again, sorry, I will jump back slightly. One particular aspect with regards to the different utilities within close proximity to each other, we have come across recently as a concern that we're working our way through, is the proximity of potential of a heat pipe close to a water main, where you could get some heat transfer into the water main that we wouldn't necessarily find useful. So that possibly will be something that my colleagues will come back when I come back to you in writing. But that is something that we've been working through in a particular project recently. With regards to decommissioning, it's around the license and the heat networks. If it comes to the point where we've got the definition also includes energy centres, for example, and we were raising earlier on about what's within the definition. I think it would be important that we consider such things as decommission right at the start before we get into the project, rather than someone lock the door and walk away. That to me doesn't feel right. So it's a case of considering it today to say if a particular project comes to its end of its life, and there's been some debate about that, what happens at the end of its life? And that might be that there is the system's decommissioned. It might be that the incumbent is allowed in a competitive environment to continue with a new contract, or it might be that there's a new contract that comes in place to take over that particular project. So it's in the round of considering right at the outset what happens at the end of the licence of the contract.
Can I ask you then, if you're able to answer this, what is the situation with the Stirling project you're involved in? Has that question been considered at the outset, and who is responsible for decommissioning?
Yeah, it's effectively, that one's slightly different because it's on a Scottish Water asset. I'll take another example, which is in Campbelltown, where we are doing an energy centre recovering heat from wastewater next to the local authority asset and some of the infrastructures on the local authority asset. That particular one, we have built in those different options. So effectively, within, I think from memory, it's 12 months of the conclusion of the 20-year contract, that the two parties come together and either agree it's the asset transfers to the local authority, we continue for a given period of time beyond the contract to be negotiated, or we decommission. And if the parties don't agree with one of those other two options, then the obligation is with Horizons to decommission the energy centre and the costs associated with that.
Okay, and does that decommissioning involve decommissioning the network itself, the pipes underground, or you just leave them in place?
Yeah, it does involve that, yeah.
Okay. Thanks very much, Convener. Sorry, unless anyone else wanted to come back on any of those questions. No. Yes, Charles Wood.
Yes, I thought it was just useful to note that this is an issue that's happened with electric vehicle charge points as well. Wayleaves and compulsion has been something that has been pushed for quite some time with EV chargers. When it's looking at rapid chargers, trying to get those in has been really problematic because they don't have that power of compulsion. Compulsion in itself has the same sort of negative connotations as the word mandate. So trying to get people on side before that and making sure you've gone through the entire process, seeing all the options first is really important. But it is equally important that where there's a positive net benefit that could be apparent from a heat network, you are able to push forward with that project. So it is a difficult one. We don't envy you the difficulty of having to get that balance right, but getting the balance right is absolutely critical.
But just to clarify, the example you used there about electric vehicle charging networks, that's not a regulated network, though, isn't it? That would distinguish it from what we're talking about here today.
So yes, that would distinguish it. If heat networks are to be regulated and given that ability, then they would be distinguished and given that greater capacity to move forward compared to EV charging.
Yes, because I think that's the important point. If you've got a regulated industry, then it's more easy to have that backstop power. Thanks, Convener.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you to our witnesses for joining us today. I will invite you again to submit anything further in writing. It may be that the clerks will write just to summarise the various points in which we would invite any further comment that you're able to give us. So I will bring this session to a close. Thank you again for joining us today, and the committee will move on to item 3 on the agenda. Item 3 on the agenda relates to the Public Procurement Amendment, etc. EU Exit Regulations 2020, which the committee has been asked to consider a notification regarding from the Scottish Government. Most of this instrument will not apply to Scotland, but rather to England and Wales. The parts of this instrument relevant to Scotland will be those where the UK Government is seeking to retain direct EU legislation with effect across the whole of the UK relating to minor matters. Now, the Scottish ministers will be bringing forward a separate amending instrument in respect of the equivalent Scottish regulations. Is the committee content for these issues to be dealt with by statutory instrument laid at Westminster? As the committee is content, I will write to the Cabinet Secretary to notify her of the committee's decision. I will now suspend the meeting and we will move into private session. Thank you.